Okay, welcome back, everybody. This will be our pattern. We'll have about 20 minutes of presentation by Wally Fletcher, about 20 minutes of a breakout group, and a short 5-minute break. This is the top of our second of 3 cycles of that. And Wally, you're on.
Okay, thank you. In this segment, I want to share with you about 11 big themes that I have gleaned from my conversations with the clergy groups that I work with, and the many other kinds of conversations that I have regularly with clergy in these times. By definition, that they even talk to me as says that this is a group that's pretty focused on self-care. They're pretty self-aware folks and people who are able to be pretty articulate about what they're experiencing, and I'm grateful for their sharing. And some of them even wrote things down, which I find helpful, because their words are better than mine around some of these things. So I'm going to kind of go through these themes with the idea that pay attention to what happens with you as you hear each of these. What resonates with you? What seems dissonant for you? What versions of these experiences do you have? And that will lead to the next discussion in the small groups about resources. What resources do you think you can think about and reflect on with respect to meeting these common demands? So I doubt if any of these will be surprising to you, but I'm going to share. These are the things that I hear most often. At the top of the list in terms of people who wrote responses was adapting to social distancing and the ambiguous role of technology in this process, especially in situations of uncertain duration and where pastoral presence and sensitivity is needed and expected most. I said ambiguous role to imply that the situation that I hear many people saying is we love it and hate it at the same time. We're grateful for it. Hard to imagine how we'd be getting through it without this. And on the other hand, it has to bring stresses and challenges of its own. People I talk to describe all kinds of versions of examples of the various stresses that they have related to these themes. And I've been struck by how many of them fit within that kind of category of moral stress and adaptive stress. Here's just a couple of quotes. Someone wrote, "Technology helps in maintaining basic connections with some folks, but it's a poor substitute in some important situations. For example, I couldn't visit a beloved member as she was dying. I tried praying with her over the phone, but I'm not sure she could hear me, and I certainly couldn't hear her. I felt like I couldn't be fully her pastor at the end of her life, and that grieves me. I also miss being able to scan the congregation for who might be in trouble," and like comments. Someone else wrote, "Only being able to connect through technology has made this present crisis distressing. Add to it my retirement at the end of the month," which was just last month, "and distress is the order of the day." This pastor had to celebrate the end of his 20-year relationship with the congregation in a way that was not what he or his congregation would have liked. And then someone else said, "Every aspect of the ministry must be retooled. This is like getting a whole new job or career. Some clergy are over-functioning and holding themselves to impossible standards. Some clergy are completely overwhelmed by the technology issues." So that's the first thing. The second theme, which is not surprising, of course, is dealing with existential fear, anxiety, and uncertainty. Anxiety is contagious, and the baseline level of realistic anxiety is high and stressful for everyone. Realistic anxiety is not the same as neurotic anxiety. It means it really is trouble, and we are having the right feelings when we experience anxiety. Ministers are working hard at helping themselves and others process anxiety in healthy instead of maladaptive ways. People's comments were around this challenge of being concerned about their own safety and health and people that they care about, and the moral risks that people even experience when they go to the grocery store and come home with the groceries, knowing that they could be the one who could bring the virus to someone else. We all live with versions of that. The third most frequent theme I've labeled dealing with complex grief. People are talking about the multiple kinds of grief that they, as well as their parishioners, are experiencing: personal and collective, present and anticipatory. Grief work is real work. It's painful, exhausting, and always takes longer than people think it should. As I was preparing the first presentation that I made around this topic, someone gave me a wonderful article. Some of you may have seen it. It was in the Harvard Business Review. The title was "That Discomfort You're Feeling is Grief." And it came out of a conversation that the staff, the editorial staff, was having about their own stress and people beginning to be in touch with what they were experiencing as grief. And so in that article, they interviewed a person who's been writing and following up on some of Kubler-Ross's work around this, and that focuses on the various, not only the stages of grief, but the various kinds of grief that we can be experiencing, of what's been lost, what do we fear is being lost or might be lost, and being aware of our own grief, the secondary grief, the secondary stress that goes with helping people process their grief, congregational, collective grief and its impact, the ways in which people behave and process their grief, sometimes in thoughtful and helpful ways, in some ways in not so helpful ways. And I was reminded of one of the most important lessons I've learned from Ronald Heifetz, when he says about change and people's resistance to change. He says, remember, people don't resist change, they resist loss. So when we see people's resistance and we encounter people's resistance, it's important to keep in mind that this element of complex grief, of numbers of different types of grief piling on, and grief does often pile on, is a big part of, maybe a big part of what we're experiencing as resistance from some people. The fourth theme, which will not be surprising, especially to some of you in struggling congregations, is financial insecurity. Financial insecurity for clergy who may be working in bivocational part-time positions where they don't have the same security that some of their other colleagues may have, and certainly a lot of concern about how congregations that were already struggling financially and barely hanging on, how this crisis is going to impact them. The fifth theme is lack of access to many normal leisure and self-care activities. People talked about how they're experiencing the restrictions on moving around and going places, and the social, and how social distancing is limiting some of the activities that in the past have been major stress reducers for clergy. People talked about how they miss certain outlets for recreation and fun and just letting off steam, and the ways in which that contributes to the difficulty of unplugging and making space and recreational space when the things that you used to rely on to help you do that are not available in the same way. And someone talked about the tendency to keep on going without Sabbath, a little harder time making a boundary between work and leisure when your workplace and your leisure place are the same small space. The lack of physical contact. Many people are talking about that more as this thing drags on. Feelings of isolation. Someone said just yesterday to me, I just miss touch. People who are living singly and who don't have a close family and people who are right there beside them experience these things in some ways more acutely or can. The sixth one of these things is dealing with complex stress and its longer term impact. Most of us are struggling with several sources of stress at the same time in this event, and making it even harder to sort out and cope. And notably is the increase in moral and adaptive stress, as I mentioned earlier in this particular crisis. One of the places of example that several people wrote to me about was the increased stress of families where people are working at home, often two spouses, different careers, and also learning how to teach school and kindergarten to their kids. Well, somebody wrote, the two most distressing things have been dealing with the technology, my overall level of productivity, and my homeschooling my children. An area that is normally a joy has now become a stressor, childcare. So lots of comments on that, as well as the impact over time of people expressing fatigue and expressing feelings of not feeling as though they're as productive as they think they should be or would like to be, and that they're not always accomplishing as much as they think they could or should. These are sources of moral stress for a lot of people. The seventh theme is meeting the challenges of authentic preaching, Bible study, pastoral theologizing, and prophetic messaging in this crisis. Finding and articulating a meaningful versus apologetic or surface framework for understanding and processing this experience theologically and spiritually. This often includes, for clergy trying to figure out how to help people do this, upholding necessary tensions between grief-bearing as well and hope-bearing, being able to help people articulate that tension, and between prophetic criticizing and prophetic energizing. I'm drawing on Walter Brueggemann here, who's one of my favorite theologians, biblical theologians, who says the nature of the work of the prophet is this tricky line of the prophetic critique of what's going on and the prophetic encouragement that people need in order to engage those problems and with hope, and that can be a really difficult thing for clergy, especially when they're concerned about the moral stress that comes with Jeremiah's warning, which always cuts deeply, where he says, they have healed the wounds of my people lightly, crying peace, peace, when there is no peace. Some clergy are concerned about how do I be authentic? How do I address these issues in ways that are not either too light or too heavy that people can't bear? In the midst of that, people that I'm talking to, no one I've talked to yet has said that they're losing their faith, But I have heard numbers of people who are saying, both as a positive as well as a source of anxiety, that they find themselves reassessing some of their own theological assumptions and perspectives in ways that are important and disturbing at the same time. The eighth theme is dealing with the I call this the fast, slow, phasic nature of this crisis over an uncertain time horizon. Even acutely difficult and traumatic crises are less difficult, or can be less difficult to deal with, than those that unfold over phases, over long periods, without significant sources of relief. They are also the ones which involve high risk and fast, slow phase transitions, where things seem to be happening too fast and too slow at the same time. Now that the first shocks and adaptive stresses have been faced, many ministers I talk to are increasingly concerned about their own and their congregations' long-term endurance and resilience in this kind of situation. The ninth theme is concerns for potential polar, and this is the one that's coming to the fore more and more in the last couple of weeks. I'm hearing more and more people, understandably, talk about this. So concerns for the potential polarization and conflict over how quickly to ease up on social distancing and return to regular worship and other meeting practices and so on. Some people call it getting back to business. Ministers who are feeling less stressed and most confident in these situations are those who feel they're working with clear consensus guidance from dioceses and other trusted authorities. They are also in congregational settings in which leaders have experience working well collaboratively together on difficult problems. Those who are most anxious are those working in congregations that remain overly leader dependent and are prone to fractiousness and or learned helplessness when leadership is perceived as ineffective or failing. Fire the coach. Many are recognizing that this crisis will be a critical test of churches' bodily health and resilience. And here I'm connecting with St. Paul's body language and how important it is for churches to unpack that body language in terms of how they behave as a body around these problems, because no one person, particularly no rector or priest or few dedicated vestry people, are going to be able to answer all these questions about that we have to answer. And so the more churches imitate Paul's body of Christ metaphor in Romans 12 and Corinthians and Ephesians 4, the better resources they will have for dealing with the stress demands of this crisis. The other two themes, I'm watching my time, help me signal, Amy, if I'm doing. The other two themes made me glad I asked a second question. I asked people to talk about what's most distressing for them. But then I thought I better ask the question another way too. I asked people, since not all stress necessarily leads to distress, what are you finding most stressful? It still can be stressful in ways you tend to experience as energizing and or positive in other ways. And I'm so glad I asked that, because people were saying, as distressing as this can be, there are also aspects of all these things that we're grappling with that also are sometimes energizing, exciting, and positive in other ways. So the two themes that came out most frequently, I call discovering untapped adaptive capacities within ourselves and our congregations. Despite high levels of distress, many churches, many clergy also offered impressive examples of ways their churches and other colleagues were surprising themselves with creative and rapid adaptation to technological necessities to which they and their congregations were formerly resistant. It was amazing how quickly churches, and I'm a pastoral associate at one of them, that have been very reluctant to move into this area, actually did it. And they did it quickly, and they're doing it well. And now some of them are even talking about maybe they should continue to make use of these things after this moves into a very different phase. There's, as someone said, there's energizing stress as rising to the challenge of learning new ways to minister. Someone else said, I kept thinking about the opportunities that the pandemic has brought to the church. We've had to think in new ways and new and creative ways. The enormity of the event also drew our staff and lay leadership together. And then someone else wrote, it's stressful but satisfying to figure out new ways of doing things. Many of my new skills and strategies are based in technology, which I never thought I would have. So even some of these same areas that were among the most intensely stressful for people also are being experienced by some of those same people as also opportunities. And then the final theme that was impressive in this area was the sense of participating in a moment of extraordinary historical and social spiritual significance. People are talking about the challenges of authentic preaching and Bible study and pastoral theologizing and prophetic messaging in this crisis as not only being stressful and scary in ways, but also energizing, inspiring. They're moved by the needs and responses of their congregants, as well as people who are tuning into their services and ministries more often or for the first time. And several people, more than one person I've talked to, has actually alluded to the idea that maybe there's a new great awakening on the horizon. So just a quote or two. The stress that has been energizing has been around preaching. I've always loved preaching. There have been Holy Week and Easter seasons when I've really struggled to find anything new to say about the gospel stories. With this new context, there's so much to say, so many new ways to interpret the text. And then someone else said, on the caution side, there's been a lot of pressure to be prophetic and comforting right now. I feel like I've been able to do that in my sermons. I'm finding a lot to say. I'm finding I have a lot to say in this strange time. And I'm encouraged that our scriptures have a lot to say. People are digging in to the scriptures. Someone else said, we've seen an uptake in attendance online. By the way, that has been a very consistent theme. It's been impressive to me how many congregations are now saying their attendance is higher than it's ever been, and they're trying to think about what to make of that. And then finally said, this crisis has opened doors for our food pantry, and so on. So in the midst of all that distress and adaptive stress that people are finding it challenging to address, there is also this creativity and energizing that's going on as people try to go deep and engage these difficult challenges in faithful and adaptive ways. So is it about right time?
That's perfect timing, Wally.
It's just not often that happens. So the second round, the focal question is, in light of these things, what resources are you finding most helpful in these times? And what kind would you like to find, share, or help create more of? Always taking some responsibility.